My hands trembled as I gripped the edges of the podium, trying to focus on the chemical equation I'd drawn on the whiteboard. The fluorescent lights of the AP chemistry classroom seemed to pulse and blur, matching the strange rhythm my heart had adopted lately. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but all 24 pairs of eyes staring back at me made it impossible to stop my presentation. The reaction between... My voice faltered as the room started spinning. Ms. Chen's concerned face swam in and out of focus. I tried to grip the podium tighter, but my fingers felt numb and disconnected. The familiar terror gripped me, the same feeling I'd been having more and more over the past few weeks. This shouldn't be happening. Not with my medication. Not unless... Zena, are you all right? Ms. Chen's voice seemed to come from far away. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The last thing I saw was Kieran, my new stepbrother, smirking in the back row as my knees buckled and the world went black. I woke up to the harsh fluorescent lights of the nurse's office and the sound of arguing voices. "This is the third time this month," Nurse Bailey was saying firmly. "We need to contact her cardiologist." "Oh, she's just being dramatic again." The dismissive voice of my stepmother Marlise cut through my fog. "You know how teenage girls are, anything for attention, especially with her brother's wedding coming up." I wanted to protest, to explain that something was seriously wrong, but my tongue felt too heavy to move. Through half-closed eyes, I watched Marlise wave her perfectly manicured hands as she spoke. "All this fainting business started right after we announced Kieran's engagement. She's just jealous of all the attention he's getting. You should have seen how she acted when her father and I got married 3 months ago." The worst part was how convincing she sounded, like a concerned stepmother dealing with a troubled teen. Nobody would guess that just last night I'd caught her in the bathroom cabinet replacing my heart medication bottles. Nobody would believe that the pills that were supposed to keep my congenital heart condition under control now tasted sweet instead of bitter. "Still," Nurse Bailey persisted, "with her medical history..." "I manage all the children's health care now," Marlise cut in smoothly. "Their father and I agreed it's best to have one person in charge. Less confusion that way. And I can assure you, Zena is getting exactly what she needs." My stomach churned at her words. If only they knew what I'd seen. The empty prescription bottles hidden in her desk drawer, the way she'd insisted on taking over all my medical appointments, the careful way she'd been replacing my real pills with sugar substitutes. But who would believe me? Dad was completely under her spell, and Kieran's upcoming destination wedding seemed to be all anyone cared about anymore. "She's probably just tired from all the excitement," Marlise continued, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Planning a wedding is stressful for the whole family, and with the costs of everything these days..." She trailed off meaningfully. That's when it hit me. The wedding, the expensive venue in Bali, the designer dress for Kieran's fiancé, the endless list of luxury expenses that Marlise kept adding to the budget. And my medication, which Dad's insurance had always covered before, suddenly becoming too expensive right after she took over. I forced my eyes open fully, trying to sit up. The room spun again, but I managed to stay conscious this time. Marlise's perfectly made-up face appeared above me, her eyes hard despite her concerned smile. "There's our little drama queen," she said sweetly. "Feeling better? Ready to go back to class?" I wanted to scream, to tell Nurse Bailey everything, but the triumphant gleam in Marlise's eyes told me it would be useless. She'd already crafted her narrative. The attention-seeking stepdaughter, jealous of her stepbrother's happiness. Who would believe the truth? That she was slowly poisoning me by replacing my heart medication with sugar pills, all to funnel more money into her precious son's wedding fund. "Dot." My voice came out as a whisper. "I think I need to..." "Perfect. Back to class it is." Marlise grabbed my arm, helping me up with a grip that was just a little too tight. "We can't have you missing any more school, can we? And just think, only 3 more months until the wedding. Won't that be wonderful?" As she led me out of the nurse's office, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. My face was pale, my lips slightly blue. But it was my eyes that scared me most. They held the look of someone who was starting to realize just how far their stepmother would go to get what she wanted. And as my heart skipped another strange beat, I wondered if I'd survive long enough to stop her. That night, I lay in bed staring at my ceiling, trying to piece together how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Just 3 months ago, my life had been normal. Well, as normal as it could be with a heart condition I'd managed since birth. Dad and I had our routine. He'd help me track my medications, drive me to my monthly specialist appointments, and always made sure I had everything I needed to stay healthy. Then came the whirlwind that was Marlise. They met at a charity gala. Ironic, considering what I know now. Dad was there representing his investment firm, and Marlise was working the room with her signature charm. Within 2 months, she'd moved into our house with Kieran. Within 3, she was Mrs. Sullivan, and everything changed. The first red flag was so small I almost missed it. My medication, which had always stayed in my bathroom cabinet, mysteriously migrated to the new family medicine center Marlise created in the kitchen. "It's more organized this way," she'd explained, showing off the labeled containers and color-coded schedule she'd created. "I managed a pharmacy for years. I know what I'm doing." That was lie number 1, I later learned. Just like everything else about Marlise, her impressive career history was carefully crafted fiction. But back then, Dad was too enchanted to question anything. "See how thoughtful she is?" He'd beamed. "She's really trying to make this work." The next change was my monthly specialist appointments. Somehow they kept getting rescheduled, then canceled. "Insurance issues," Marlise would explain vaguely. "But don't worry, I've got it handled." Meanwhile, Kieran's wedding plans grew more extravagant by the day. Designer suits, 5-star venues, first-class flights for the entire wedding party to Bali. I remember the day I first noticed something wrong with my pills. I'd always taken them with breakfast, 2 small blue tablets that kept my heart beating in the right rhythm. That morning, they looked slightly different, rounder, maybe a bit whiter. When I mentioned it to Marlise, she smiled that plastic smile of hers. "The pharmacy changed suppliers," she said smoothly. "Same medication, just a different manufacturer. Much more cost-effective." She paused, shuffling through wedding venue brochures. "We all need to do our part to help with expenses, don't we?" Kieran's wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event. Later that day, I overheard her on the phone in her home office. The door was cracked open and her voice drifted out, sharp with excitement. "Yes, we've cut almost $4,000 from the monthly expenses," she was saying. No one's noticed. These rich families, they never check what anything actually costs. It's all going straight into the wedding fund. My blood ran cold. I knew she had to be talking about my medication. It was the only major monthly expense that had changed. But when I tried to tell Dad, he just shook his head. "Marlise is helping us budget better," he insisted. "Do you know how much your medication costs? Insurance doesn't cover everything, and with the wedding coming up, the wedding. Always the wedding." Kieran's perfect day had become the sun around which our entire family orbited. Every conversation, every decision, every dollar spent or saved came back to making sure his celebration would be unforgettable. Meanwhile, I was getting dizzy spells almost daily, my heart skipping beats in a way it hadn't since I was a little kid. That night, after my fainting spell at school, I tried one last time to reach Dad. "Something's wrong with my medication," I whispered, catching him alone in the kitchen. "I think Marlise is—" "Enough!" His voice was sharp, final. "Marlise is trying her best to help this family, and all you do is criticize. I know the wedding is bringing up feelings about your mother, but you need to stop this attention-seeking behavior. Marlise is right. You're just being dramatic." I stared at him, this stranger who used to be my father, and felt my heart break in a way no medication could fix. As I turned to go upstairs, I heard Marlise and Kieran laughing in the living room, probably over more wedding plans. And in that moment, I realized I was completely alone with the truth. A truth that was slowly killing me. Another lie. I'd done some digging online. There was no record of Marlise ever working in healthcare. But she knew enough to make her deception believable, and that was all that mattered. Just like she knew exactly how to play the concerned stepmother, always ready with an explanation for my declining health. "Stress about the wedding," she'd tell my teachers when they expressed concern about my falling grades. Attention-seeking behavior? She'd sigh to Dad when he found me crying from chest pain. Just jealousy, she'd whisper to Kieran, loud enough for me to hear. Some people can't stand seeing others be happy. The worst part was watching my prescription bottles being refilled right on schedule. Marlise would make a show of picking them up from the pharmacy, but I knew what was really inside those bottles now. I'd tested one of the pills in my AP chemistry lab when no one was looking, pure sugar pressed into a perfect replica of my medication. One day, I overheard her talking to Kieran about the wedding budget. "Don't worry, sweetie," she cooed. "Mommy's taking care of everything. That trust fund your father set up for precious Zena's medical expenses? It's going to give you the wedding of your dreams." Kieran's laugh made me sick. "What about her heart thing? Isn't it like serious or whatever?" "Please," Marlise scoffed. "She's been babied her whole life. A few months without those overpriced pills won't kill her. And after the wedding, we'll suddenly find a more affordable alternative. No one will ever know." That night, I lay in bed feeling my heart stutter and skip, knowing that somewhere in this house, my real medication was being traded for sugar pills while my medical trust fund was being drained for crystal champagne flutes and designer table settings. The room spun every time I moved, and my chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. Dad passed by my room and paused at my door. For a moment, I thought he might come in, might finally see how sick I really was. But then Marlise's voice floated up from downstairs. "Honey, can you help me with these wedding favors?" And he walked away without a word. I pulled out my phone and added another entry to my diary, my fingers shaking as I typed, "Day 47 without real medication. Don't know how much longer I can last, but I have to stay alive long enough to prove what she's doing. I have to—" My grades started dropping like stones. First chemistry, then English, then everything else. It's hard to focus on schoolwork when your heart feels like it's trying to escape your chest and the room won't stop spinning. Ms. Chen, who had once praised me as her best student, now looked at me with a mixture of disappointment and concern. "Zena, this isn't like you," she said after I failed my third lab report. "I know things at home are different now, but you can't let it affect your future." She slid a pamphlet for the school counselor across her desk. I didn't bother picking it up. How could I explain that I wasn't acting out or seeking attention? That my stepmother was slowly killing me to pay for her son's dream wedding? The nurse's office became my second home. Monday, dizzy spell during PE. Wednesday, nearly passed out in the cafeteria. Friday, had to leave math early because my vision went blurry. Each time, Marlise would show up with her concerned stepmother act, ready with a new excuse. "She's just upset about the wedding seating arrangements," she told the nurse after my fourth visit that month. "Teenagers can be so sensitive about these things." The nurse looked doubtful, but wrote it down anyway. Meanwhile, I caught glimpses of Kieran texting his friends about the private jet that would fly the wedding party to Bali. One particularly bad day, I overheard Marlise talking to Kieran's fiancée, Ember, in the kitchen. "Try this one, sweetie," Marlise was saying. "It's only $5,000 more than the other dress, and you look absolutely stunning in it." "But what about the budget?" Ember asked. "I thought we were trying to cut costs?" Marlise's laugh made my skin crawl. "Oh, don't worry about that. I found plenty of ways to redistribute the family expenses. Did you know how much they were wasting on unnecessary medical costs? It's criminal what these drug companies charge. But I'm taking care of it." I slumped against the wall, my heart doing its now familiar dance of skips and jumps. $5,000 for a dress upgrade. That was 3 months of my medication. 3 months of normal heartbeats and clear vision and being able to climb stairs without feeling like I was dying. My teachers started having meetings about my declining performance. They sent emails to Dad, who forwarded them to Marlise, who crafted perfect responses about family stress and teenage adjustment periods. She even suggested that maybe I was developing an eating disorder to explain away my increasing pallor and weakness. "We're keeping a close eye on her," she wrote in one email I saw on Dad's laptop. "It's so hard for girls this age watching their brother prepare for such a joyous occasion while dealing with their own issues." The teachers ate it up. Poor, troubled Zenna, acting out for attention while her perfect stepbrother prepared for his perfect wedding. The final straw came during wedding dress shopping. Marlise insisted I come along, probably to show everyone what a caring stepmother she was. As Ember tried on her third designer gown, each more expensive than the last, I felt the familiar darkness creeping into my vision. "I need to sit down," I mumbled, but no one was listening. They were all focused on Ember, twirling in a cloud of white silk that cost more than a year of my medication. I made it to a chair just before my legs gave out. Through the fog, I heard Marlise's voice. "Oh, look at her, always having to make everything about herself. This is why we didn't make her a bridesmaid, Ember. She'd just cause a scene during your special day." The boutique owner looked concerned. "Should we call someone?" "No need," Marlise said smoothly. "She does this for attention. Watch. In a minute she'll be fine, especially if we stop looking at her." They went back to discussing veils and trains, while I sat there fighting to stay conscious, my heart beating a broken rhythm in my chest. That's when I realized, if I didn't find help soon, I might not live to see the wedding at all. Hope arrived unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing lavender perfume and carrying a worn leather medical bag. Grandma Aurora had always had perfect timing, but this visit might just save my life. She took one look at me sprawled on the couch, trying to catch my breath after climbing the stairs, and her eyes narrowed. "Zenna, sweetheart," she said, her voice carrying traces of her years as head pharmacist at Cedar Memorial. "How long has your heart been racing like that?" Before I could answer, Marlise swooped in from the kitchen, all perfect smile and calculated charm. "Aurora, we weren't expecting you until next week for the wedding planning brunch." Her voice was sweet, but her eyes were sharp. "Zenna's just being a bit dramatic today. You know how she gets." But Grandma Aurora hadn't spent 40 years dispensing medications and catching prescription fraud to be fooled by Marlise's act. While my stepmother was distracted by a call from the wedding planner about imported flowers, Grandma Aurora slipped into the kitchen and headed straight for the medicine cabinet. I watched from the doorway as she examined my prescription bottles, her face growing darker with each one she opened. "Sugar pills," she muttered, rolling one between her fingers. "Pressed to look identical. But—" She turned to me, and I saw fury building behind her professional calm. "Where are your real medications, Zenna?" "I don't—" I started, but then remembered. "Her office desk, bottom drawer. I saw her hide the empty bottles there." Marlise was still in the living room, arguing about rose varieties for the wedding arch. We had maybe 5 minutes. Grandma Aurora moved with the quiet efficiency of someone used to handling medical emergencies. She found the drawer key taped under Marlise's desk. Amateur move, Grandma's eyes seemed to say. And there they were. 6 months' worth of empty prescription bottles, medical receipts, and insurance documents. "Oh, you foolish, wicked woman," Grandma Aurora whispered, photographing everything with her phone. "You have no idea what you've done." That's when we heard the click of Marlise's heels approaching. Grandma Aurora closed the drawer and slipped the key back just as Marlise appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing in my office?" Her voice was sharp, the friendly stepmother act slipping. "Looking for a pen to write down my cornbread recipe," Grandma Aurora said smoothly. "Zenna mentioned Kieran loves cornbread, and I thought it would make a lovely addition to the wedding menu." The mention of the wedding did its usual magic, sending Marlise into a detailed description of the 5-tier cake she'd ordered. But as she led Grandma Aurora back to the living room, I saw my grandmother's hand squeeze into a fist around the evidence in her pocket. Later, after Marlise left for another wedding planning session, Grandma Aurora laid out the facts. 6 months without proper medication. Your heart could have stopped completely. Her voice shook with controlled rage. The sugar pills are identical. She must have had them custom made. That takes planning, connections. "Dad won't believe us," I said quietly. "He thinks I'm just jealous of Kieran." "Your father," Grandma Aurora said grimly, "is about to get a very rude awakening. I've documented everything. The fake pills, the empty bottles, the diverted insurance payments. But more importantly—" She pulled out an envelope, heavy with official-looking papers. "I've had this ready since the day your father married that woman. Sometimes you can't trust people to do the right thing until they're forced to face the consequences." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a detailed account of my inheritance from my mother's side, money that was supposed to be used for my medical care, now being systematically drained for crystal champagne flutes and designer wedding favors. "The trustees have to sign off on any changes," Grandma Aurora explained. "And guess who's still the primary trustee?" Her smile was fierce. "We've got her, sweetheart. Now we just have to play this smart." For the first time in months, I felt my heart steady in my chest. Not from medication, that would take time to fix, but from something just as powerful: hope. As Grandma Aurora made calls to her lawyer friends, I realized that sometimes justice comes not in dramatic moments, but in quiet ones, with evidence folders and medical records and the unshakable love of someone who refuses to look away from the truth. That night, everything exploded during family dinner. Dad had insisted on these weekly, family bonding meals since the wedding planning began, probably hoping they'd magically turn us into one big happy family. Instead, they became a stage for Marlise's latest wedding updates and Kieran's endless complaints about how my drama was stealing attention from his special day. But this dinner was different. Grandma Aurora sat at her place, calmly cutting her chicken while Marlise rambled about imported table linens. "The silk alone costs more than some people's entire weddings," she was saying, "but Kieran deserves the best." "Speaking of costs," Grandma Aurora said mildly, placing her fork down. "Zena, darling, how are you feeling? Your color seems off." Before I could answer, Marlise jumped in. "Oh, she's fine. Just tired from all the excitement. Weddings are so stressful for everyone, aren't they?" "Interesting you should say that." Grandma Aurora's voice could have frozen fire. She pulled out a small plastic bag containing one of my pills. "Because I had these analyzed this afternoon. Would you like to explain why my granddaughter's heart medication has been replaced with sugar pills?" The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's fork clattered against his plate. Kieran stopped mid-chew. And Marlise, for the first time since I'd known her, looked genuinely scared. "That's ridiculous," she sputtered. "I've been managing Zena's medication myself. The pharmacy just changed suppliers." "Save it." Grandma Aurora's voice cut like steel. "I called every pharmacy in a 50-mile radius. None of them switched suppliers. None of them filled these prescriptions." She laid out the empty bottles from Marlise's desk. "But they did fill the real ones, which you've been emptying and replacing with counterfeits." "Dad," I whispered, watching his face turn gray. "I tried to tell you. The weird taste, the dizzy spells." "It's not what you think," Marlise said quickly. "I was just trying to help with expenses. These medications are so overpriced. And with the wedding—" "The wedding?" Grandma Aurora's laugh was bitter. "You mean the wedding you're funding with money stolen from Zena's medical trust? Yes, I found those records too." That's when Kieran, perfect golden boy Kieran, made things worse. "Oh, come on. She's obviously faking it. She's been jealous of my wedding since day one." "Right, Dad." But Dad wasn't looking at Kieran. He was looking at me. Really looking at me. For the first time in months. At my blue-tinged lips, my shaking hands, my chest rising and falling with the irregular rhythm of a heart struggling to keep beating. "How long?" he asked, his voice hollow. 6 months, I said quietly. "Since right after the wedding, since Marlise took over the medications." "It was for Kieran's happiness," Marlise suddenly shouted, her mask finally cracking. "Do you know how much those pills cost? Money that could be spent on his perfect day. She's young. She's strong. A few months wouldn't kill her." She never finished that sentence because at that moment, my heart decided it had had enough. The room tilted sideways, darkness creeping in at the edges. The last thing I heard before I collapsed was Grandma Aurora's voice, sharp with fury. "Call 911 now!" I woke up to beeping monitors and the antiseptic smell of hospital sheets. Dad was slumped in a chair beside my bed, looking 10 years older. When he saw my eyes open, he started crying, something I hadn't seen since Mom's funeral. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying. "I should have listened. I should have seen." "Where's Marlies?" I managed to ask. "Gone. The police are looking for her. His voice broke. "She and Kieran tried to leave for Bali early with all the wedding money. Your grandmother stopped them." I closed my eyes, feeling the steady drip of real medication flowing through my IV. "The trust fund? We'll get it back," he promised. "Every penny. And Marlies? She'll pay for what she did. Your grandmother made sure of that." Outside my hospital room, I could hear Grandma Aurora arguing with doctors, insurance companies, and probably half the hospital administration, fighting for me, like she always had, like a real parent should. Maybe that's why I didn't feel the triumph I'd expected. Just a deep, aching sadness for everything that had been broken, and a glimmer of hope for everything that could still be fixed. The hospital became my home for the next 2 weeks. The doctors didn't sugarcoat it. My heart had taken serious damage from months without proper medication. "You're lucky to be alive," Dr. Reeves told me bluntly. "A few more weeks of this and we'd be having a very different conversation." The police came to take my statement. Detective Santos sat beside my bed, recording everything as I explained about the switched pills, the drained trust fund, and all the tiny moments that had built up to this. She didn't interrupt, didn't question whether I was being dramatic. She just listened and took notes, her face growing grimmer with each detail. "We found the company that manufactured the sugar pills," she told me afterward. "A small operation in Mexico. Your stepmother had quite the setup. Fake prescriptions, forged insurance documents. She's done this before, it turns out." That was the part that hit Dad hardest. The detective showed us files on 3 previous cases, 3 other marriages, 3 other families Marlies had scammed. She had a pattern: find wealthy single parents, charm her way into their lives, then systematically drain any trust funds or insurance policies she could access. "The wedding was her favorite cover," Detective Santos explained. "Who questions expensive charges when there's a wedding to plan? And if anyone raised concerns, she'd paint them as jealous or attention-seeking." Dad sat in the corner during these conversations, getting smaller with each revelation. The man who used to tackle every problem head-on could barely meet my eyes now. One night, when he thought I was sleeping, I heard him talking to Grandma Aurora in the hallway. "I failed her, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "I let that woman hurt my baby girl because I was so desperate to believe in this perfect new family. How can Zena ever forgive me?" "That's not your job right now," Grandma Aurora replied firmly. "Your job is to help her heal and make sure justice is served. Speaking of which," there was a rustling of papers. "The lawyers found something interesting in Marlise's financial records." The next day, a team of forensic accountants descended on our house. They traced every penny Marlise had moved, every account she'd accessed. The numbers were staggering. Along with draining my medical trust fund, she'd taken out loans in Dad's name and opened credit cards using my information. All told, she'd stolen nearly $500,000, most of it funneled into untraceable offshore accounts. She was planning this exit strategy from day one, Detective Santos explained. The wedding was just a convenient excuse to speed up the timeline. Once she had the money, she and Kieran were going to disappear to a country with no extradition treaty. My heart monitor beeped steadily as I processed this. 6 months of suffering, of being called dramatic and attention-seeking, all so my stepmother could pull off one last big score before vanishing with her son. Kieran, it turned out, was as much a con artist as his mother. The police found fake IDs and passports in his room, along with a burner phone containing messages about their escape plan. His whole Golden Boy act had been just that, an act. He'd known about the switched medications, the stolen money, everything. "What happens now?" I asked Detective Santos. "Now?" She smiled grimly. "Now we wait for them to slip up. People like Marlisa, they can't help themselves. They always think they're smarter than everyone else. And we've frozen every account, flagged every passport. They won't get far." She was right. 3 days later, Marlise and Kieran were caught trying to cross the Canadian border with suitcases full of cash and jewelry bought with my trust fund money. The wedding planner, it turned out, had been working with the police ever since Grandma Aurora's first call. Watching the arrest footage from my hospital bed, I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. Instead, I felt a deep exhaustion, like my body was finally allowing itself to recognize how close to death I'd really come. Dad sat beside me, holding my hand as the news played footage of Marlise being led away in handcuffs, still screaming about her son's perfect wedding. "I'll spend the rest of my life making this right," he promised quietly. I squeezed his hand back, feeling the steady rhythm of my healing heart. Sometimes, I was learning, justice doesn't feel like triumph. Sometimes it just feels like finally being able to breathe again. Recovery was a slow process, measured in small victories and careful steps forward. The doctors kept me in the hospital for another week, monitoring my heart as it slowly remembered its proper rhythm. But the real healing started when Grandma Aurora brought in the inheritance letter, the one she'd been keeping safe since the day Mom died. "Your mother knew something like this might happen," she explained, sitting on the edge of my hospital bed. "Not this exactly, but she worried about your father remarrying, about someone trying to take advantage of your condition. That's why she set up the trust fund the way she did." The letter was thick with legal papers, but the message was clear. Mom had arranged everything so that no one, not even Dad, could access my medical trust fund without Grandma Aurora's approval. The money Marlise had stolen? She'd managed it through a complicated web of fraud and forged signatures. "We've already started the recovery process," Grandma Aurora said, spreading out documents across my blanket. "Every penny she took, every account she touched, we're getting it all back, and there's more." She pulled out another envelope, this one containing photos and documents I'd never seen before. "Your mother was smart, Zenna. She knew that money alone wasn't enough protection. She left a letter for you to be opened if anything like this ever happened." My hands shook as I opened it. Mom's familiar handwriting filled the pages. "My dearest Zenna, if you're reading this, someone has tried to take advantage of your condition. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there to protect you, but I want you to know that you're stronger than anyone knows, stronger than I was at your age. Your heart condition isn't a weakness to be exploited. It's proof of how hard you fought just to be here." Tears blurred my vision as I read on. Mom had included everything: medical records, insurance information, even a list of trusted doctors and pharmacists who had promised to help if anything ever happened to her. She'd thought of everything, protected me even years after she was gone. "There's one more thing," Grandma Aurora said softly. She pulled out a final document, a revised trust agreement. "Your mother set this up as a backup plan. If anyone ever tried to misuse your medical fund, the entire trust would convert to your direct control at age 18. With proper oversight, of course." She smiled. "Happy early birthday, sweetheart." I stared at the papers, understanding slowly dawning. In 3 months, when I turned 18, I would have complete control over my medical care and the trust fund meant to support it. Marlise's actions had actually accelerated the timeline, triggering the conversion clause Mom had built in. "But that's not all," Grandma Aurora continued. "The police found something interesting in Marlise's records. She didn't just steal from your trust fund. She committed insurance fraud in 3 states. The insurance companies are pressing charges, and under state law, they're required to pay restitution to the victims." She handed me another document, a preliminary settlement offer that made my eyes widen. The amount was more than triple what Marlise had stolen. That's enough for a lifetime of medical care," Grandma Aurora finished. "Plus college, plus a home of your own someday. Your mother wanted to make sure that if anything like this ever happened, you'd come out stronger, not broken." I ran my fingers over Mom's signature at the bottom of her letter, feeling closer to her than I had in years. She'd known, somehow she'd known, that I might need protection someday, and she'd built an invisible shield around me, one that had activated exactly when I needed it most. The heart monitor beeped steadily beside me, a reminder that I was healing, that I would survive this. Dad appeared in the doorway, carrying more papers from his meetings with the lawyers. He looked exhausted but determined. "The house is sold," he announced quietly. "Between that and my savings, we can repay everything Marlise stole while we wait for the legal proceedings." He met my eyes. I know it doesn't fix what happened, but it's a start. I held up Mom's letter. She knew, Dad. She knew we'd need help someday. For the first time in months, I saw him smile. Really smile. Your mother, he said softly, was always the smartest person in any room. The day of what should have been Kieran's perfect Bali wedding dawned cold and gray. Instead of exotic flowers and silk tablecloths, the only ceremony taking place was in a stark courtroom downtown. I sat between Dad and Grandma Aurora, watching as Marlise and Kieran were led in wearing orange jumpsuits instead of designer clothes. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Detective Santos had built an airtight case. Fake prescriptions, forged documents, surveillance footage of Marlise replacing my medication, text messages between mother and son planning their escape. But it was the financial records that sealed their fate. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, the defendants didn't just steal money. They systematically endangered the life of a minor by tampering with vital medication. They showed not just criminal intent, but a callous disregard for human life. Marlise's perfect mask had cracked completely. She sat at the defendant's table, her roots showing and her makeup smeared, looking nothing like the polished stepmother who had terrorized me for months. When they asked if she wanted to make a statement, she stood up, her eyes wild. "Everything I did was for my son!" she screamed, making me flinch. "For his perfect day. That little brat had everything, the trust fund, the fancy doctors, the constant attention. My Kieran deserved his chance to shine." The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Mrs. Sullivan, or whatever your real name is, you deliberately endangered the life of a child for the sake of a party. There is no justification for that." Kieran wouldn't even look at me. He stared straight ahead, his golden boy facade replaced by something cold and hard. When it was his turn to speak, he just shrugged. She was always complaining about her heart anyway. How were we supposed to know it was real? The jury took less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. Guilty on all counts: fraud, theft, child endangerment, conspiracy. The judge didn't show any mercy in sentencing. Marlise Weber, also known as Marlise Sullivan, also known by 6 other aliases. The judge read, "You are sentenced to 15 years in state prison. Kieran Weber, you are sentenced to 8 years. She peered over her glasses at them. "Furthermore, you are both ordered to pay full restitution to the victims, including all medical expenses incurred due to your actions." As they were led away, Marlise finally broke completely. "You ungrateful little witch!" she shrieked at me. "We could have been a family. Your father could have had a real wife, not just memories of a dead woman." Dad started to stand, but I grabbed his hand. "She's not worth it," I whispered. And she wasn't. Watching her being led away, I felt nothing but a deep, bone-deep exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. They wanted statements, sound bites, something to make their story juicier. But Grandma Aurora shepherded us through them with the same efficiency she'd shown in protecting me all along. "The only statement we're making," she told them firmly, "is that justice has been served. Now, let this family heal." Later that night, sitting in our half-packed house, we were moving in with Grandma Aurora while we figured out our next steps. Dad found me looking at old photos of Mom. "I keep thinking about what Marlise said," I admitted, "about giving you a real wife." Dad sat beside me, picking up a photo of Mom holding me as a baby. "Your mother was the most real person I've ever known," he said quietly. "What we had was real. What Marlise offered was just a beautiful lie. I'm sorry I couldn't tell the difference." "Mom knew," I said, showing him her letter again. "She knew you might get lonely, might want to believe in something beautiful again. That's why she protected me. Not because she didn't trust you, but because she knew how much you wanted to trust others." Outside, the sun was setting on what should have been Kieran's wedding day. But instead of celebrating a fraud's perfect moment, we were sitting in a quiet room, holding pieces of our broken family and starting to put them back together. 1 year later, I stood in front of my AP chemistry class again, but this time my heart beat with a steady, strong rhythm. My final presentation was on pharmaceutical compounds and their sugar-based counterparts. Ms. Chin had approved the topic with a knowing smile. This time, when I gripped the podium, my hands were steady. Sometimes the difference between life and death can look as simple as two nearly identical pills, I began, watching my classmates lean forward. They all knew my story. It had been impossible to hide after the media coverage of Marlise's trial, but they didn't know everything. After my presentation, I headed to Grandma Aurora's house. My house now, too. We'd sold our old place and moved in with her permanently. The money from the sale, combined with the insurance settlements and recovered trust fund, had been set aside for my future. But more importantly, living with Grandma Aurora meant having someone who understood both the medical and emotional sides of recovery. Dad was in the kitchen when I got home, attempting to make Mom's old lasagna recipe. He'd started cooking therapy as part of his healing process, trying to reconnect with Mom's memory in a healthy way. Most attempts were disasters, but we ate them anyway, laughing together over burnt edges and too much garlic. "Big envelope came today," he said, nodding toward the table. "From Stanford." My hands shook slightly as I opened it, this time from excitement, not medication issues. "Dear Ms. Zena Mitchell," I read aloud, "we are pleased to inform you." The kitchen erupted in cheers. I'd been accepted to Stanford's pre-med program with a full scholarship. The essay that had clinched it? My story of surviving medical fraud and deciding to become a doctor specializing in cardiac care for teens. "Your mother would be so proud," Grandma Aurora said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Both of her career choices, medicine and law. You're going to help so many people." She was right. I'd already started in a way. The detective who handled Marlise's case had connected me with other families she'd scammed over the years. Together, we'd formed a support group and advocacy organization, pushing for stricter laws about medication tampering and better protections for kids with chronic conditions. Later that night, I sat in my room, once Mom's old room, reading her letter again. I'd memorized every word, but somehow it brought new comfort each time. Next to it, I kept my own letter, the one I'd written during those dark days when Marlise was switching my medication. It had become something of a viral story after the trial, published in medical journals and legal reviews as a warning about prescription fraud. Dad appeared in my doorway, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate, our new nightly ritual. "Penny for your thoughts?" "Just thinking about how different everything is from last year," I said, taking my mug. "Remember how Marlise said her son deserved a perfect day? Turns out perfection isn't what we think it is." He nodded, understanding. We'd learned that the hard way. Perfect families could be poison, while broken ones could heal stronger than ever. Perfect weddings could hide ugly truths, while quiet moments of honesty could rebuild trust. My phone buzzed, a text from Detective Santos. They'd caught another pharmaceutical fraudster using my case as a template for identifying warning signs. Another family saved from going through what we did. "You know," Dad said softly, "your mother used to say that hearts don't just pump blood, they pump truth. Eventually, everything hidden comes to light." I touched my chest, feeling my strong, steady heartbeat. Mom was right, as always. My heart condition, the thing Marlise had tried to exploit, had ended up being my strength. It had taught me to fight, to recognize truth from lies, and most importantly, to trust my own rhythm. "To imperfect families," I said, raising my hot chocolate in a toast. Dad clinked his mug against mine. "And to perfect endings." Outside, the spring breeze carried the scent of Grandma Aurora's roses, real ones, not the imported flowers Marlise had ordered for her fake perfect day. Sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that grow right where you are, nurtured by love and truth and the simple, steady beating of a heart that refuses to be silenced.